The grand halls of imperial Russia shimmered with candlelight and gold leaf. Aristocrats waltzed beneath chandeliers, their laughter echoing against frescoed ceilings, as poets toasted to reason and enlightenment. History remembers these faces, the refined, the enlightened, the beautiful. But outside those ornate walls, hidden beneath layers of frost and silence, another Russia struggled to breathe. In the vast countryside, beyond the reach of music and marble, millions of men, women, and children bent their backs to the frozen soil. Their names were rarely recorded, their lives scarcely mourned. These were the serfs, the invisible engines of the empire's glory, living property who sustained their master's wealth while losing every fragment of their own humanity. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Russia in the 17th century stood at a strange crossroads. The nobility devoured French philosophy and dressed in imported silks, dreaming of Parisian sophistication. Yet at home, they upheld one of the most brutal systems of bondage the world had ever seen. The Cathedral Code of 1649, a document meant to bring order to the sprawling Russian state, became instead a noose around the neck of its people. It declared that peasants were bound forever to the land, and by extension, to their lords. This single decree transformed millions of free peasants into property. The nobles rejoiced. They could now buy, sell, and punish at will, rights once reserved for kings. The Tsar's favor had given them absolute dominion over life and death, and they wielded it without mercy. But it wasn't always meant to be this way. Once, long before the decree, peasant communities lived with a semblance of freedom. They worked the soil, paid their dues, and prayed in the same churches as their masters. Over time, however, as wars drained the treasury and landowners demanded stability, the state made a pact with cruelty, loyalty to the crown in exchange for dominion over souls. Serfdom was not slavery by name, but in essence it was far worse. A slave might be sold abroad, beyond the sight of their captor. A serf remained forever in the same soil, the same pain, beneath the same sky, generation after generation. It was bondage that disguised itself as belonging. To understand the cruelty of the system, one must imagine a world where a human being could be listed alongside livestock in estate ledgers. A world where a child's worth was measured not by their potential, but by their market value. The laws even protected the master's right to dispose of his peasants as he pleased. A serf could be beaten to death without the slightest risk of imprisonment. Noble women and men alike indulged in this authority as though it were divine law. Their estates became miniature kingdoms, their will the only truth that mattered. And within this hierarchy of despair, power corrupted the soul. For every philosopher who praised reason, there were dozens of landlords who lived by instinct and indulgence, acting not as guardians, but as gods of terror. The church's sermons about compassion rang hollow when delivered to congregations where both lord and serf knelt side by side, one with blood on his hands, the other with chains on his wrists. Orthodoxy's teaching spoke of humility and brotherhood, but in practice it sanctified obedience. A serf's suffering was often described as God's trial, a path to salvation through endurance. Yet beneath this moral theater, rebellion simmered. In the hushed corners of wooden cottages, old women whispered stories about justice, about divine vengeance, about the day when the earth would swallow the unjust. For every noble estate built on cruelty, there existed a quiet defiance, a will to survive, a belief that the soul could truly not be owned. As centuries passed, Russia's grandeur grew, but so too did the darkness beneath it. By the dawn of the 18th century, the empire's nobility had become addicted to control. They justified their dominance with poetry, science, and even God. But beneath those illusions, their world was built on the broken backs of millions who had no voice. And it is those forgotten faces we turn to now. The people whose sweat built the palaces of St. Petersburg, whose suffering echoed through generations. The story that follows is not about the brilliance of empires, but about the brutality that sustained them. For every gilded ballroom, there was a dark cellar. For every symphony, a muffled cry. And in the heart of that silence, the trade in human life began to flourish, where even a young girl's beauty could be bartered like gold.
The year 1649 is often remembered by historians as a triumph of order in a chaotic empire. The Cathedral Code, decreed under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, was designed to strengthen the state, unify laws, and bring peace to a land scarred by rebellion. Yet hidden between its lines was a death sentence for freedom itself. With a single stroke of a pen, it chained an entire class of people, binding peasants not only to the land but to the whims of their masters. For centuries after, this law would whisper through Russia like a curse. It gave the nobility what they had always desired: absolute control over human lives. The serf was no longer a man or woman in the eyes of the law, but an extension of the estate. If a noble sold his land, the people living on it were sold with it as naturally as one might sell cattle or horses. The nobles called it stability, the peasants called it despair. To justify this hierarchy, the church wove divine reasoning into the chains. Priests preached that God himself had arranged the order of life, czar above all, nobles beneath him, and peasants below. They spoke of duty and humility, of bearing one's burden in this life to earn peace in the next. In the flickering light of the icon lamps, serfs knelt before gilded altars, praying to the same saints as their masters, believing perhaps that heaven would finally make them equal. But heaven was far away, and hell was much closer. Across the empire, noble estates sprawled across thousands of acres. The landowners lived like monarchs of their own tiny kingdoms, their power unchecked. They held courts, issued punishments, and controlled marriages. If a serf tried to flee, soldiers hunted them down like fugitives. Returning home often meant mutilation or death. Some were branded with hot irons, symbols of shame that marked them for life. This was not the Russia of gilded icons and poetry. It was a Russia of frozen fields and silent endurance. In the depth of winter, when snow buried the roads and the rivers froze solid, serfs continued their work, harvesting, hauling, building, dying. The masters measured their productivity not in effort, but in obedience. Among nobles, cruelty became a form of entertainment. Letters from the period tell of landlords who punished a peasant for laughing or executed an entire family over a missing tool. The empire's bureaucracy turned a blind eye. The suffering of the peasantry was too common to be worth recording. And so, the system thrived. Russia's leaders claimed to admire the Enlightenment blooming in Europe, the philosophies of liberty, human reason, and dignity. Yet while French salons debated Rousseau and Voltaire, Russian salons were filled with laughter at the expense of servants beaten into submission. The contradiction was not lost on foreign visitors, who wrote of a land where gold and blood mingle freely and compassion is buried beneath protocol. By the 18th century, serfdom had evolved beyond economics. It was a psychological order, a way to maintain distance between those who command and those who must obey. The nobleman's identity depended on this hierarchy. Without it, he would lose his reflection, the image of superiority that defined his existence. To be born a serf was to inherit invisibility. A man could not own his name, his wife, or his labor. The children he raised were not his heirs, They were the property of another man's estate. A woman could not refuse her master's advances, nor could her husband defend her. To do so would mean death. There are recorded instances of peasants attempting rebellion, burning their masters' homes in the night. But even rebellion became an illusion of power, each uprising crushed beneath cavalry hooves and muskets. Still, the memory of resistance survived in secret songs, in old prayers whispered before dawn, in lullabies that spoke of deliverance. In this world, even small acts of defiance carried meaning. A mother hiding her child during a census, hoping to keep them off the estate's record. A man refusing to bow after being struck. A priest slipping bread to a starving family behind the landlord's back. These were the quiet rebellions that kept the spirit alive. And yet the deeper tragedy was this: cruelty became normal. The society around it, priests, scholars, and even peasants themselves, learned to see bondage as the natural order. It wasn't just imposed by force, but by belief. The historian Kluchevsky once wrote, "The Russian nobleman believed that he ruled men, but that he owned them by nature." It was this belief that hardened hearts and made monsters of otherwise educated minds. By the mid-1700s, Russia had become a patchwork of fiefdoms, each lord a little god, each peasant a disposable soul. And as generations passed, the line between human and property blurred completely. But not all the cruelty came from ignorance. For some, it came from choice, from pleasure. And soon, a new economy emerged within this hierarchy, an economy not of grain or land, but of flesh. What began as domination would evolve into trade. And within that trade, young girls would become the empire's most sought-after commodity.
It began quietly, without fanfare, without conscience. Somewhere between the rhythmic tolling of church bells and the rustle of coins, human life became a negotiable good. By the dawn of the 18th century, a shadow market thrived beneath the glitter of the Russian Empire, a market not for wheat or silver, but for souls. Serfs could be traded, gifted, or mortgaged, their names written in the same ledgers as livestock. But it was the young, the beautiful, the unguarded, the hopeful who became the most desired currency of all. Girls barely past childhood were dressed in clean linen and combed hair before being paraded as property. A fair complexion, a timid smile, or the suggestion of grace could raise their price more than acres of fertile land. This trade was not a secret. It was the quiet machinery of noble life, the unspoken arrangement that everyone pretended not to see. The transactions took place in markets like the Arubinsk Fair, where peasants were exchanged under the watchful eyes of merchants and priests alike. A surviving record from the publication Russian Antiquity describes one such event with chilling precision. A priest from Suvalsk province told of a noblewoman who gathered 30 young boys and girls, children of her own serfs, and had them transported to the fair. They were lined up beside cattle pens and sold to Armenian traders. There was no outrage, no punishment, no redemption. The churchman's words read less like a confession than an observation, as if he were describing the weather. To the nobles, serfs were part of the estate's capital, a form of wealth that could be displayed, exchanged, or leveraged. A well-trained maid could be a token of gratitude. A young woman of beauty could be an extravagant gift. When a noble visited another's estate, it was not unusual for a servant to be offered as part of the welcome, an act of generosity cloaked in civility. And behind the rituals of power, there was always fear. Serfs lived knowing that any knock at the door might not be from a friend, but a messenger come to take them away forever. The stories of these transactions haunt Russian folklore even now. surviving as fragments in rural songs and ghost tales. A mother dreaming that her daughter's shadow still walks the road to the fair. A husband burying the shoes of his vanished wife so her spirit can find its way home. These weren't just stories, they were collective memories encoded in whispers because truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. For the young women caught in this cruel exchange, their fates varied only by the whims of their buyers. Some were taken to distant lands, sold into domestic service, or worse. Others were absorbed into noble households as attendants, objects of beauty for the master's pleasure. The lucky ones, if such a word could ever apply, were those who simply survived long enough to fade into anonymity. Russia's educated elite often compared themselves to Europe's aristocracy. They read French poetry, wore powdered wigs, and quoted Enlightenment philosophers at dinner. But beneath their salons, the same darkness thrived. The empire's nobles prided themselves on culture and refinement, yet treated the human body as a collectible artifact, something to be appraised, owned, and discarded. Foreign travelers who visited Russia during this time were horrified. One French observer wrote, "Nowhere does the grandeur of palaces shine so brightly, nor the stench of injustice cling so close to the earth. It was an empire of illusions, elegance above, agony below." There was, however, one thing the nobility could never silence: the quiet dread that grew among the peasants. With every sale, every separation, every mother who lost her child, the foundations of the empire weakened. Suffering had begun to ferment into rage. But the story of the markets is not just one of transactions. It is a mirror of a decaying soul. For when a society begins to trade its own people, it also sells the remnants of its morality. And soon, out of this marketplace of bodies emerged a figure whose name would become a symbol of the empire's rot. A woman who transformed cruelty into ritual and punishment into performance. Her name was Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova. The peasants called her something else. They called her Saltychicha, the bloody baroness.
Among Russia's noble class, cruelty was often masked by etiquette, dressed in lace and perfume. But there were those who made no effort to hide it, who let their power bloom into madness. Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova was one of them. To the outside world, she was a refined noblewoman, the widow of a respected officer and the heir to vast estates near Moscow. Her mansion stood proud and orderly, her gardens perfectly trimmed, her servants always silent and obedient. But behind those ornate walls, a private theater of horror unfolded, one that would stain Russian history for centuries. The peasants whispered her name with dread, Salchika, the bloody baroness. Her cruelty was not born of rage, but from routine. It was said she began each morning with prayer and ended the day in violence. When her serfs failed to please her, when a maid broke a cup or left a smudge on the floor, Saltykova's temper would ignite like a spark in dry hay. She would beat her servants herself or have them dragged to the cellar for discipline. Eyewitnesses spoke of her punishments: whips, rods, boiling water poured over hands. Sometimes she ordered their hair to be burned off as they knelt crying for mercy. She had no sense of proportion. Her fury could be triggered by a missing towel or an unpolished candlestick. For her, pain was not a consequence, but a custom. The most infamous story is told of a young mother who worked in her service. The woman, weak from hunger, failed to complete a cleaning task.
Saltykova beat her to death in the courtyard. When villagers carried the body to a nearby church for burial, the baroness demanded that the dead woman's infant be placed on top of her corpse during transport. By the time they arrived, the child had frozen to death. Such scenes would seem unimaginable if they hadn't been recorded in testimonies and archives. Over the years, more than 100 victims were believed to have perished under her hand. Some she beat until their bones broke, others she drowned or starved. Her estate became a house of fear. Servants whispered prayers before entering her chamber, knowing they might not return. And yet, for decades, she went unpunished. Why? Because she was noble. And nobility, in that age, was a shield stronger than any law. The officials who received complaints from peasants dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. When two of her surviving servants tried to seek justice, they were accused of defamation and punished instead. It was not until one of them fled directly to the royal court, risking death, that the case reached Empress Catherine II herself. Catherine the Great, though no stranger to power's temptations, could not ignore the scandal. Saltykova's crimes threatened to expose the moral rot at the heart of the empire. For months, an investigation unfolded. Testimonies poured in, dozens of witnesses describing torture, murder, and mutilation. Even the empress, hardened by politics, was horrified. In 1768, Daria Saltykova was finally convicted of the murder of 38 serfs, though historians believe the true number was far higher. Her punishment was both symbolic and severe. She was publicly displayed in Moscow, chained and labeled a tormentor and murderer. Crowds gathered to see her, not with pity, but with hatred. Afterward, she was sent to a convent prison, condemned to live out her remaining years in darkness, with no human contact. There, in a windowless cell, she spent 33 years. She was allowed no visitors, no mirrors, no light. It is said that when guards brought her food, she whispered prayers to herself, not out of remorse, but out of madness. Daria Saltykova became more than a murderer. She became a symbol of unchecked power, a living monument to a system that allowed one woman's vanity to eclipse an entire village's life. Her story spread through Russia, not as rumor, but as revelation. Even now, her legend lingers like smoke. Her mansion was later abandoned. Locals claimed they could still hear screams echoing through the halls at night. Some believed her ghost roamed the grounds seeking new victims, still craving the control that death had taken away. But beyond the haunting, there was a deeper truth. Saltyka was not an exception. She was the inevitable product of a society that gave mortals the power of gods and expected them to remain human. And she was not alone. Others, like Alexandra Kozlovskaya, would follow her path. Noble women who turned cruelty into ceremony and whose depravity would make even seasoned soldiers shudder. Because when evil becomes tradition, it no longer hides in the shadows. It wears a crown and calls itself refinement.
If Daria Saltykova was the embodiment of wrath, then Alexandra Kozlovskaya was its refinement, a cruelty sharpened into art. Hers was not the frenzy of a madwoman, but the calculated ritual of someone who took pleasure in absolute control. In the candlelit chambers of her estate, beneath ceilings painted with cherubs and saints,
She transformed punishment into performance. Kozlovskaya was a noble woman of wealth and reputation, known in her circles for her sophistication, her taste in imported perfumes, and her exquisite French gowns. Yet behind her elegance hid a depravity that her peers whispered about only behind closed doors. She was said to be beautiful but venomous, with eyes that lingered on her servants not with warmth but with appraisal. Her victims were often the young girls who worked closest to her, maids, laundresses, kitchen attendants. Their crime was rarely anything tangible, a misfolded sheet, a drop of spilled tea, or simply the misfortune of catching her gaze at the wrong moment. When Kozlovskaya punished, it was not to correct, but to dominate. Survivors later described scenes so grotesque that even hardened soldiers could not repeat them without trembling. The girls were ordered to strip naked and kneel on cold marble floors. Kozlovskaya would walk among them in silence, her heels echoing through the hall like a metronome of dread. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost tender, as she gave the order for the whipping to begin. But the punishment never ended with her servants. When they grew tired, Kozlovskaya herself would take up the rod, her fury hidden behind the same composed face she wore at dinner parties. She often forced the girls to lay their bare chests on a marble table polished smooth by generations of use, its surface cold, reflective, merciless. There she continued, until skin split and screams turned to silence. Her violence, like Saltykova's, went largely unpunished. Nobility in 18th century Russia was not merely a title, it was an immunity. When rumors reached local officials, they dismissed them as domestic matters. After all, what was the suffering of a few peasants compared to the dignity of a landowning family? Yet what made Kozlovskaya particularly terrifying was the precision of her cruelty. She took notes, she kept lists. Her punishments were scheduled, measured, recorded, an obsessive ritual that blurred the line between sadism and science. To her, pain was a language, and she spoke it fluently. There are whispers, half legend, half truth, that Kozlovskaya invited certain guests to witness her punishments under the guise of discipline demonstrations. These gatherings, if they truly occurred, reveal a horrifying truth about the age. Cruelty was not hidden, it was entertained. Aristocrats sought novelty, and Kozlovskaya provided it, dressed in civility and perfume. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her story is how ordinary she appeared to her peers. In portraits, she sits upright, her posture regal, her expression calm, an image of control. To look at her, one would never guess that her hands once trembled not from fear, but from exhilaration. Historians have struggled to understand women like Kozlovskaya. Some see in her the reflection of her own oppression, a woman trapped in a patriarchal order, mimicking the violence of men to assert her own power. Others reject that reasoning, arguing that she was simply intoxicated by authority, her cruelty a choice, not a response. Whatever her motive, her legacy remains as a testament to how power, when inherited without empathy, corrodes the soul. Kozlovskaya may not have killed as many as Saltykova, but her name became synonymous with refined barbarity, a reminder that even silk can conceal a blade. The brutality of these noble women was not isolated.
Their behavior mirrored a broader decay spreading through Russia's aristocracy. The line between punishment and pleasure was dissolving, replaced by an appetite for domination that no longer needed reason. And soon the stage of cruelty would shift from the salons of noblewomen to the estates of men who wielded power like art. Landlords who collected instruments of torture as others collected fine wines. Among them was a man named Nikolai Struski, whose tastes made even the most perverse seem almost civilized by comparison. He would turn pain into sport and his manor into a house of death.
In the rolling fields of Penza province stood a grand estate, a house of music, literature, and murder. Its master, Nikolai Struski, was a man of culture by reputation, a patron of the arts, a poet of some repute, and a favorite among intellectual circles of the late 18th century. But beneath his veneer of refinement lay an imagination darker than any poem could contain. Struski's estate was a paradox, walls lined with books from Paris, halls echoing with piano sonatas, and in the cellar, an arsenal of instruments no symphony could ever redeem. Visitors to his manor spoke of elegant dinners, of conversation and charm, yet the servants' eyes told a different story, eyes that never met another's gaze for fear of what might be seen. Behind closed doors, Struski indulged his most twisted curiosity, the study of pain. His basement was fitted with devices of his own design, racks, iron clamps, hooks, and chains, crafted not for punishment, but for experimentation. He called it his collection, as if cruelty were an art form to be refined and catalogued. According to accounts later uncovered, Struski often invited guests of similar disposition, other nobles, men of letters and philosophy, to witness his tests. He justified his actions as inquiries into human endurance, as though torment could be elevated to intellectual pursuit. His victims, of course, were his serfs, those who could neither consent nor escape. He devised contests of suffering, forcing peasants to run back and forth across the basement while he fired pistols at their feet. Sometimes he missed deliberately, prolonging their terror. Other times, he did not. It became known as the running game. The penalty for slowing down was death. He is said to have killed over 200 souls in this grotesque theater of pleasure and power. And yet, Struski faced no punishment. His wealth bought silence, his charm protection. In letters to friends, he wrote of the necessity of maintaining discipline among the lower orders, language so sterile it erased the screams behind it. For the empire, men like Struski were simply eccentric, not evil. In many ways, he represented the pinnacle of Russia's decaying aristocracy, educated, eloquent, and utterly divorced from empathy. He quoted poetry while ordering executions, played violin as his servants were whipped, and commissioned portraits of himself surrounded by books and musical instruments, as if culture could cleanse the stench of blood. There is a chilling symmetry to Struski's life. His obsession with control mirrored the empire's own, the nobility's desperate need to prove superiority over those they crushed. Power, once absolute, demanded constant performance. The noble had to remind himself he was master, lest he see the truth reflected in the eyes of those beneath him, that he was nothing more than a man who feared losing what he had stolen. Some historians argue that Struski's cruelty was not madness, but symptom, a logical consequence of a world where one class was born to command and another to suffer. In such a world, empathy became a flaw, mercy a weakness. The system rewarded domination. The soul merely followed suit. But not all the nobility indulged through death. Some sought pleasure in other ways, ways equally cruel, yet cloaked in luxury. For these lords, control took a different form. Their estates were not dungeons of pain, but palaces of indulgence. They collected not weapons, but women, not as companions, but as possessions. These harems of the Russian elite were whispered about, but rarely condemned. To the aristocracy, they were simply part of life, a mark of prestige, a symbol of power. It was said that a nobleman without a harem was like a soldier without a sword. And so began another chapter of degradation, one where beauty itself was bound in chains.
In the glittering twilight of the Russian Empire, when salons gleamed with laughter and chandeliers swayed above powdered wigs, there existed another world beneath the silk, a secret kingdom of submission and silence. The harems of the nobility were not spoken of openly, but everyone knew. They were the unholy heart of an empire that worshipped beauty, yet crucified innocence. To own a harem was not considered scandalous among the Russian elite. It was a symbol of refinement, an unspoken badge of status. Just as one might display imported porcelain or a French tutor, a collection of concubines became a reflection of taste. Young girls, often serfs barely in their teens, were chosen for their appearance, their obedience, or their fear. They were taken from their families without warning, their parents too terrified to resist. To be chosen was to vanish.
Within the walls of the manor, the girls' lives were meticulously regulated. They slept in small chambers near the master's quarters, dressed in the silks he provided, and were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Their beauty was their curse, the very thing that condemned them to servitude. Some were forced to sing, others to dance or serve guests at feasts, their smiles rehearsed like masks. There was no love, no consent, no escape. The nobleman's desire was law, and his will could not be questioned. If a girl resisted, she was beaten. If she cried, she was mocked. The very concept of dignity dissolved in the air of those estates. To the outside world, these harems were cloaked in euphemism. Visitors spoke of maidens of service or companions of the household. The women themselves were erased by language, reduced to functions. History remembers the names of their masters, but not theirs. They remain phantoms, footnotes in ledgers, initials in church registers, or unmarked graves beyond the manor walls. Among nobles, the practice even took on the flavor of fashion. They compared the graces of their harems in whispered conversations over wine. A certain etiquette developed, a perverse code among gentlemen about the selection of girls, the number of rooms, the refinement of their manners. In letters, they boasted as though describing art collections, not living souls. What makes this reality more grotesque is how seamlessly it coexisted with Russia's rising culture of enlightenment.
While philosophers in St. Petersburg debated the rights of man, noblemen in the countryside paraded their serfs like trophies. The contradiction was staggering, and yet it was the essence of the age. One landowner wrote in his diary, "The peasant woman is born to serve, as the earth is born to bear." He believed this sincerely. That belief, echoed by thousands, justified every cruelty committed in the name of noble right. For the women, life in the harem was a cycle of survival. Some learned to read their master's moods, to anticipate their commands, to stay invisible when danger flared. Others simply faded, losing their voices, their names, their hope. When they aged or displeased their master, they were sent back to the fields, broken and nameless. The younger ones replaced them, as if pain itself had become a seasonal harvest. And yet, within these dark rooms, small sparks of humanity endured. The girls comforted one another, whispered lullabies from their childhood, or prayed to icons hidden under their pillows. In those stolen moments of solidarity, they remembered what it felt like to be human. Many historians now believe that the rage and desperation born from such secret cruelties helped ignite future revolts. The peasants' uprisings of the 18th century, the fires, the vengeance, the cries for justice, were not merely about hunger or taxes. They were about the violation of dignity, generation after generation. Still, among the upper class, the cruelty continued as if untouched by consequence. Some nobles even elevated their debauchery into pageantry, transforming their harems into theatrical displays for their guests, where pleasure and humiliation merged into one ghastly spectacle. And among these twisted patrons of lust stood two men whose names would become synonymous with depravity and pride: Prince Ivan Gagarin and Prince Nikolai Yusupov. Their estates were not merely homes, they were stages where women were forced to play angels for the entertainment of their masters. It is in their stories that the empire's moral decay would reach its most haunting crescendo, where art and obscenity, faith and sin danced together beneath the golden ceilings of the Russian aristocracy.
When night fell over the Russian countryside, it did not bring peace, it brought fear. For many serfs, especially women, the setting sun marked the beginning of dread, not rest. The flicker of a torch on the road, the sound of hooves in the distance, or a sudden knock at the door could mean only one thing: the master's messenger had arrived. In those moments, entire households froze. Mothers clutched their daughters. Husbands stood silent, knowing resistance meant death. The messenger's orders were always brief, emotionless. The master requests the girl. And just like that, she would be taken, sometimes for a night, sometimes forever. These abductions were not rare or secret. They were part of the unwritten customs of noble life. The power of a landowner was absolute. His whims were law. For many women, there was no refuge, no justice, no escape. They were expected to submit as the soil submits to the plow. When the master was finished, the victim would return, if she returned at all, broken in body and spirit, her eyes forever distant. Husbands, fathers, and brothers could do nothing. To protest was rebellion. To defend a wife was treason. There are accounts of men who tried and paid with their lives, publicly flogged, mutilated, or sent to Siberia as warnings. And yet, in the face of such despair, the peasants remembered. They whispered. They waited. The empire's official records mention none of this, but in peasant songs, in the oral traditions passed from grandmother to grandchild, the truth endured. Songs of stolen brides, of dishonored wives, of daughters who vanished into the night. Some of these stories were wrapped in superstition, ghosts of girls wandering in moonlight, seeking the homes they'd never see again. But beneath the myth was history itself. Historians have noted that many peasant uprisings, those sudden, violent outbursts that terrified the nobility, were not spontaneous. They were acts of vengeance, sparked by private wrongs, a wife defiled, a child taken, a family humiliated beyond endurance. The brutality of landlords sowed the very seeds of their downfall. The irony is bitter. The same class that feared revolt the most was the one that cultivated it. Every act of abuse was another ember smoldering beneath the empire's frozen surface. And while the Tsars spoke of divine order and loyalty, entire villages dreamed of fire and freedom. In some estates, landlords kept meticulous records of births among their serfs, not out of care, but control. Girls were catalogued like livestock, marked by age and beauty. When they reached a suitable age, they were taken to the manor. The mothers who resisted were punished. The fathers were forced to watch. These were not isolated incidents, but recurring patterns across vast territories of Russia. Imagine a society where a man's daughter could be stolen in the night and he must continue to bow to her captor at dawn, where the church preached submission even as it turned its face away from rape, where morality was measured not by compassion but by rank. The landlords justified themselves in strange ways. Some claimed it was tradition, others privilege. Many saw no need for justification at all. They believed that power was its own virtue, that if God had placed them above others, then all below existed for their use. And yet, as time went on, their nights grew restless. The same lords who commanded others by day were haunted by visions after dark, visions of faces they had silenced, cries they had ignored. Letters from the period speak of noblemen who refused to sleep without candles lit, who dreamed of the dead standing at their bedsides. The empire was beginning to feel the weight of its own conscience. But conscience alone could not undo centuries of cruelty. The machine of aristocratic indulgence continued, fueled by pleasure, power, and fear. Each new generation inherited not only wealth, but wickedness, rituals of degradation passed down like heirlooms. The peasants waited still, watching their masters grow more decadent, more detached from reality. The gap between their worlds widened until it became an abyss, and into that abyss would soon fall the names of the so-called gentlemen of grace, men whose estates became theaters of decadence, where women danced, not by choice, but by command. Among them, two names would stand above the rest: Prince Ivan Gagarin and Prince Nikolai Yusupov, noblemen whose pleasures blurred into blasphemy and whose legacies would forever stain the golden fabric of Russia's nobility.
The Russian aristocracy loved to dress its sins in silk.
Behind the polished mirrors and grand staircases, behind the orchestras and gilded portraits, lay appetites that no etiquette could disguise. Among the countless nobles who indulged in the corruption of their class, few names gleamed so darkly as Prince Ivan Gagarin and Prince Nikolai Yusupov, two men whose cruelty was not hidden by madness, but displayed as elegance. Prince Ivan Gagarin was, by all accounts, a man of poise and grace. His manners were impeccable, his reputation as a host legendary. His estate was said to be a masterpiece of harmony, sprawling gardens, marble corridors, and a music room that echoed with song. But the music that played there was not of joy. It was of obedience. Within Gagarin's estate, there existed a quiet orchestra of souls, 9 in number, whose songs were not born of freedom, but of command. He called them his angels, though their wings were invisible, clipped by obedience. Each day they rehearsed melodies not of joy, but of surrender. Notes shaped by fear, rhythm carved by silence. Two among them, women of wandering spirit, were forced to guide the others, teaching movement and grace as if passing on a sacred art, yet knowing it had been twisted into ritual. In that house, beauty was no longer a gift, it was a chain polished to shine like virtue. What should have been art became an echo of control, a dance choreographed by power, performed before the mirror of cruelty. Each evening, the prince would summon them to his chamber. The girls would enter barefoot, dressed in thin gowns that shimmered under candlelight. He demanded silence before the music began, silence so deep that one could hear the trembling of their breath. Then came the songs, slow and haunting, echoing through the hall as Gagarin watched from his velvet chair, glass in hand, eyes cold with ownership. To him, these performances were theater. To the girls, they were torment disguised as grace. Every mistake was punished harshly, sometimes with lashes, sometimes with isolation in the cold stone cellars beneath the estate. Gagarin's cruelty was measured, methodical, and always followed by polite applause. But even his decadence seemed almost modest compared to Prince Nikolai Yusupov, one of the richest men in the empire. The Yusupov family was ancient, descended from nobles who had served the czars for centuries. They were patrons of art, collectors of jewels, owners of vast estates. To the world, Nikolai Yusupov embodied refinement, the perfect nobleman. But his private world was one of grotesque indulgence, where art and sin intertwined like vines choking the same tree. Yusupov's estate near Moscow was renowned for its architectural beauty, fountains, sculptures, and a theater that rivaled the imperial court. Yet behind its golden curtains, performances of a different kind took place. The prince had his own troupe of concubines, young women selected from his serfs, trained by a choreographer he imported from Europe. Their purpose was to please, to entertain, to obey.
Yusupov's favorite amusement was the theatrical evening. Guests were invited from across the empire to attend what he called divine spectacles. At his signal, the young women, dressed as nymphs, angels, or muses, would enter the stage. They danced gracefully, the perfection of their movement betraying the terror beneath. When the music stopped, Yusupov would rise from his seat, and the charade of civility would collapse into depravity. He called it art. His guests called it genius. None dared call it what it was, enslavement. But perhaps the most disturbing creation of Yusupov's imagination was the labyrinth of angels, a vast garden maze behind his mansion. Within it, he staged nightly masquerades, where his concubines, dressed in wings and veils, wandered the paths while male guests sought them out. Whoever was found first became the evening's entertainment. To outsiders, it was a game. To those inside, it was horror gilded in myth. This grotesque theater reflected not just Yusupov's corruption, but the empire's soul itself. Here was a class that believed beauty justified cruelty, that art could sanctify sin. These were men raised to believe the world existed for their pleasure, and that pain, so long as it was another's, was merely the price of elegance. And so, night after night, beneath the flickering glow of chandeliers, Russia's nobility danced upon the bones of its own people, unaware that the echoes of those dances would one day become the sound of revolution. The nobles thought themselves untouchable, their sins buried beneath wealth and bloodlines. But history does not forget. It listens. It waits. And even among the darkest stories of this age, one tale stood out, a grotesque metaphor for an empire that had lost its soul. For deep within Yusupov's estate, his labyrinth was not merely a garden, it was a reflection of hell itself.
In the heart of Prince Nikolai Yusupov's estate, where fountains whispered and marble statues gleamed under the moonlight, stood a creation that defied morality and mocked divinity, a labyrinth. But this was no garden for leisure or contemplation. It was, as one witness described, a temple built for sin. The Labyrinth of Angels, as Yusupov called it, was his masterpiece, a twisted blend of art, cruelty, and control. The maze stretched across the estate's gardens, hedges trimmed high enough to hide the moon, pathways winding like serpents. At its center stood a pavilion draped in silk and gold, lit by hundreds of candles. It was here that the performances ended and the horror began. Each night the prince's chosen concubines, his angels, were dressed in costumes of pale chiffon and lace. Feathered wings were fastened to their backs, gilded masks to their faces. They were forbidden to speak. Their task was to wander through the labyrinth under the moonlight, while Yusupov's guests, noblemen drunk on wine and arrogance, entered after them. The game was simple. Find the angel, and she was yours for the night. Laughter and footsteps echoed through the hedge-lined corridors as men pursued trembling figures who tried in vain to hide. The rustle of wings, the sound of a broken branch, the cry of a trapped girl. These became the music of the evening. For the guests, it was entertainment. For the women, it was terror. The labyrinth symbolized more than Yusupov's personal depravity. It was a microcosm of Russia's feudal world. The nobles roamed freely, guided by desire and privilege, while the powerless fled through endless corridors with no way out. Beauty became bait, innocence a spectacle. And when the dawn came, the labyrinth was silent again, its pathways washed clean, ready for the next masquerade. Some claimed Yusupov saw himself as an artist, believing his games expressed the union of beauty and suffering. In his journals, now lost but referenced by later historians, he described pain as the purest theater and control as the truest poetry. He hired painters to capture these nights in delicate sketches,
winged figures fleeing through the moonlight, their terror immortalized in graceful lines. To those who viewed the art, it was sublime. To those who lived it, it was damnation. But not all who witnessed his spectacles remained silent. There were whispers, servants who escaped, foreign guests who wrote in secret diaries of the mad prince of Moscow. Yet, as always, the truth dissolved in luxury. The empire's elite were masters at burying their scandals beneath gold. Yusupov's labyrinth was eventually abandoned, overgrown with ivy, its paths consumed by the forest. Locals said that on quiet nights the sound of wings could still be heard rustling through the overgrowth, and that ghostly figures wandered beneath the moon, angels searching for the exit they never found. But beyond myth, the labyrinth stands as an allegory of its age. The nobility of Russia had built a maze of their own, a moral labyrinth with no center, no escape, only the pursuit of pleasure, circling endlessly toward decay. They cloaked their sin in beauty, mistaking cruelty for sophistication, mistaking indulgence for art. It was this illusion that blinded them when the world began to change. Beneath their estates, the earth trembled. Among the serfs, whispers turned to fury. The same peasants who once built the walls of these gardens would one day tear them down. And though Yusupov's name would echo for generations, remembered not only for his wealth, but for his bloodline, the same blood that would later produce the man who helped murder Rasputin, his legacy would always carry the stench of corruption. The labyrinth he built was more than a place. It was a prophecy. Because no matter how high the hedges grew, no man can hide forever from the truth. And while some nobles drowned in pleasure, others turned cruelty into economy, reducing human life to arithmetic, breeding souls for profit as if they were cattle. One of them, a man named Boris Tarasov, would take the horror of ownership to its most grotesque logic, selling men, keeping women, and calling it progress.
The story of Boris Tarasov reads like a parable written by the devil, a tale not of lust or wrath, but of arithmetic. While others sought pleasure in cruelty, Tarasov found profit in it. His logic was cold, his tone matter-of-fact, and his reasoning horrifyingly rational. In his world, human lives were no longer souls, they were assets. Tarasov was not a prince, nor a philosopher, but a guardsman, a man of moderate rank who retired to his estate with ambition and calculation. In an age where nobles squandered fortunes on French wines and imported chandeliers, he prided himself on being practical. He measured everything in yield, in efficiency, in future value, even people. Especially people. When his neighbors asked why he had sold off every male serf on his land, he replied with chilling clarity. As you all know, I have sold the men of my village. Only women and young girls remain. I am 25, strong and patient. In 10 years, I shall have hundreds of new serfs born under my roof. In 15, I will sell them all. No horse breeding brings such profit. In those few sentences lies the soul of an empire. Tarasov's words, recorded by a witness and later published in historical accounts, were not the ramblings of a madman. They were the logic of a system that had lost all sense of humanity. The same government that preached Christian morality allowed a man to breed human beings like livestock and call it enterprise. To his peers, Tarasov's methods were shocking, yes, but also quietly admired. Some saw in him a visionary of land management, a man who understood how to maximize returns. They didn't call him a monster. They called him clever. This was how deeply corruption had seeped into the veins of Russia's aristocracy. When ownership of people becomes normal, morality dies in silence. No whip is needed, no scream is heard, only the sound of coins sliding across polished tables. The idea of human capital, though not yet named as such, was alive and thriving in the empire's vast countryside. Landowners calculated the number of births and deaths on their estates with the same precision used for wheat or cattle. Some kept journals noting which women bore strong children, which families produced obedient sons. The church baptized these infants without question, sanctifying the cycle of exploitation. In this twisted arithmetic, a woman's womb became an economic tool. Her body was a factory of future labor. Love, choice, and humanity were irrelevant. The master's profit dictated destiny. There are surviving records of estate inventories where the serfs are listed not by name, but by category. 3 milkmaids, 2 young seamstresses, 1 aging mother and her child. The total value was written beside them in rubles. Human existence had been reduced to bookkeeping. Such practices were not anomalies. They were the quiet foundation of the empire's rural wealth. The grand palaces of Moscow and St. Petersburg, the lavish salons and imported art collections, all were financed by the invisible economy of human flesh. And yet, even amid such darkness, there were murmurs of unease. A few writers, priests, and even noble reformers began to question the system. One clergyman wrote in his diary, "The peasant's suffering is our inheritance, their tears the price of our bread." But his words remained buried in private journals, drowned out by the laughter of feasts and the scraping of violins. Tarasov's chilling boast represents more than one man's depravity. It is the climax of a moral collapse. A civilization that once believed itself chosen by God had turned its faith into justification, its religion into chains. But the human heart, however broken, cannot remain silent forever. Beneath the veneer of obedience, resentment grew. Stories spread of women praying for plague to sweep through the estates, of men sharpening scythes not for harvest, but for vengeance. The winds of rebellion began to stir, carrying the scent of fire and the memory of the dead. Still, before that reckoning came, the aristocracy would reach new depths of degradation. Even the sacred vows of marriage, the sanctity of the wedding night, were no longer safe from violation. For some landlords, the right of dominion extended even to that first sacred hour between husband and wife. It was called the right of the first night. And its most infamous tale came from a small village called Smikanovo.
The village of Simikovo was small and quiet, a patch of earth lost amid endless fields and forests. Its people lived by the rhythm of the seasons, tilling the soil, tending to livestock, praying for mild winters. But in Smikovo, as in much of Russia, even the sanctity of marriage could be stolen. For the lord of that land believed himself entitled not only to the peasants' labor, but to their love, their bodies, and their first night of union. It was known as the rite of the first night, a custom whispered about more than written, a grotesque inheritance from Europe's darkest feudal traditions. Historians still debate how often it truly occurred, but in Smikovo there is no doubt. The story that survives is too vivid, too cruel, too precise to be myth. The young bride was said to be radiant, the daughter of hard-working peasants who had long served their master faithfully. On the day of her wedding, the village gathered to celebrate. The church bells rang, the air filled with laughter, and for a brief moment, even the poorest among them felt joy. But that evening, the sound of hooves shattered the peace. A messenger rode through the mud, bearing the Lord's command. The bride was to be brought to his manor alone. Her parents refused. Her husband begged for mercy. But mercy was not part of the noble vocabulary. The master's men returned with chains. The parents were bound before their neighbors as an example. The girl was dragged screaming from her home, her white wedding dress torn and stained with earth. What happened in the manor is not detailed in the records, but it does not need to be. The chronicler wrote simply, "She was dishonored before her parents' eyes." Afterwards she was returned, silent, hollow, her innocence and dignity stolen forever. Her mother went mad within days. Her father took his own life before the year's end. The villagers buried their pain beneath silence. To speak was to invite destruction. To remember was to bleed again. Yet the story endured, passed through whispers, carried by firelight, told in secret from generation to generation. It became both legend and warning, a tale of how absolute power can devour even the sacred. What makes the tale of Smikovo unbearable is not just the cruelty, but the ordinariness of it. The landlord was not a notorious sadist or a monster by reputation. He was simply another nobleman, respected, educated, occasionally charitable to the church. His crime was not in his nature, but in his permission. Society gave him the right to do what he wished, and so he did. In this way, the rite of the first night became less a ritual and more a reflection of a system built on ownership. If a man could possess the labor of another's hands, why not the purity of another's love? The law may not have written it, but the world enforced it. Even as Russia moved toward the Age of Enlightenment, these medieval shadows clung to its heart. The aristocrats quoted Voltaire while their peasants prayed for deliverance. The empire built theaters to celebrate virtue and beauty, while its villages drowned in despair. Some landlords continued these abuses well into old age, long after their own vitality had faded. Their lust turned not to passion, but to habit, to the thrill of control itself. The act was no longer about desire. It was about domination, and from that sickness came perhaps the most pitiful figure of all, the aging nobleman who could no longer fulfill his own appetites, yet refused to surrender the illusion of power. Among them was landowner Kashkarov, a man whose twilight years would show that cruelty, once learned, never truly dies.
When age finally crept into the bones of the nobility, it did not bring wisdom, it brought obsession. The empire's most ruthless masters, once drunk on youth and desire, found themselves imprisoned by the very power they had wielded. Their bodies grew frail, but their hunger for control did not fade. It twisted into something colder, more pathetic, more grotesque. Among these fading tyrants stood landowner Kashkarov, a name whispered in disgust by the few who dared remember him. He was old, wealthy, and paralyzed by the terror of irrelevance. Once a vigorous man of influence, Kashkarov had long since lost his physical strength, and yet he clung to his rituals of dominance as if they could keep death itself at bay. Kashkarov maintained a private harem of 15 girls, all young enough to be his granddaughters. They lived in isolation, locked behind heavy oak doors, their laughter forbidden, their smiles rehearsed. Even though he was no longer capable of the acts that once defined his cruelty, he demanded that the illusion continue. Each night, the girls were made to undress before him, to read him fairy tales by candlelight, while he reclined motionless in his bed. If any refused, if any dared to cover themselves, the frail old man's fury ignited with terrifying clarity. He would scream for his servants, order whippings, demand obedience, desperate to prove to himself that he was still master. For him, cruelty had become sustenance, the only reminder that he still existed. The irony of Kashkarov's life was almost poetic. He had once boasted that power made men eternal, that through dominance one could transcend weakness. Yet, as his body failed him, his tyranny became an echo of impotence. Power had consumed him from within, leaving behind only the shell of a man haunted by his own authority. It was said that in his final years, he refused to sleep without his angels around him. The girls sat in silence by his bedside until dawn, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling from exhaustion. The old man would mutter prayers to himself, snippets of scripture twisted into justification. When he finally died, they buried him in the family vault, surrounded by marble angels. The symbolism was unintentional, but perfect. The monsters of empire always wished to be remembered as saints. Kashkarov's story was the final verse in a symphony of decay. From the Cathedral Code of 1649 to the blood-stained salons of the 18th century, Russia's nobility had built an empire upon the backs and bodies of those who could not resist. Their wealth was carved from hunger, their elegance draped over bones. But empires built on cruelty are like winter palaces, magnificent, yet doomed to melt when the thaw comes. The murmurs of rebellion that once trembled in the cottages of serfs would soon roar through the countryside. The peasants who once bowed their heads began to raise them. Songs of suffering became songs of vengeance. And in 1861, when Tsar Alexander II finally abolished serfdom, it was not out of mercy, but necessity. The empire could no longer stand beneath the weight of its own sins.
Yet even freedom arrived like a ghost, too late for the millions already broken and too fragile to heal the wounds of centuries. Still, something had changed. The silence that once hung over the land began to lift. The stories of the peasants, their pain, their endurance, their humanity, survived in whispers and letters, in folk songs and fireside tales. Their oppressors are now dust, their estates crumbled, their portraits faded, but the memory of those who suffered endures. History, after all, does not remember the tyrants for their elegance. It remembers the cries that echoed beneath their music. The labyrinths of cruelty, the harams of shadows, the estates of blood and silence have all returned to the earth. Grass grows over the graves of nobles and peasants alike. But if you listen closely, in the wind that moves through the old birch forests of Russia, you can still hear it, the faint murmur of the forgotten, the song of those who once had no voice. And their whisper says what every empire must one day learn. Power without compassion is not strength, it is rot.